an international relations expert. And Emmanuel, well, we got an exciting race ahead of us. I mean, you previously said you feel that the polls will shift to Macron's favor in a head-to-head contest. But statistically, right now, within the margin of error, it's a dead heat. What does Macron have to do to put some distance between himself and Marine Le Pen? And what could Le Pen do to maybe just catch up enough to just overtake Macron?
Well, it's mostly a question of which votes from the first round are going to go to Marine Le Pen or to Macron. And one of the big question marks are the voters of the far-left candidate Mélenchon, who made about 20%. Now, it's interesting because Mélenchon is far-left, but most of his voters are blue-collar workers, and many of them actually identify with Le Pen, because don't forget that even though Le Pen is described as radical right, her economic platform is actually much closer to the left.
Right, and she's been focusing on that part of the platform.
And this actually appeals to a lot of the voters of Mélenchon, the far left. So a lot of those voters may actually go to her because Macron for them is just an elitist, and they hate him. I mean, a lot of those voters were in the streets three years ago. You know, the yellow jackets.
The yellow jackets.
So it's all a question, really, as I said, and also, by the way, also on the right. So, for example, the center-right candidate Valérie Pécresse, who completely crashed, did less than 4%. She said she would vote for Macron, but that's very few voters. The right-wing voters, on the other hand, those coming from Zemmour, from the far right, are all going to vote for Le Pen. So it's a very open race. In other words, the most polls talk about like a 53-47 margin, and that might change. You know, they have 2 weeks.
Right. So, but what do you think Macron? Okay, you talked about where those votes would go. Well, what do the candidates? What can they? Well, you mentioned Le Pen obviously focusing on economic issues rather than her traditional nationalistic far-right positions. What does Macron have to do in order to try to put some distance?
I think he should talk a lot about foreign policy and remind voters that Le Pen, like, for example, other leaders in Europe who are similar to her ideologically, such as Viktor Orban, and we talked about it last week. Le Pen traditionally has been very pro-Putin. She's in favor, it's in her platform, of quitting NATO, at least the military command of NATO. So reminding voters that, you know, Le Pen is actually, historically, even though she removed this picture with Putin from her platform, was very much in favor of Vladimir Putin, of this like nationalist, very conservative attitude, anti-Americanism, which talks to a lot of voters, while Macron has handled the international issues pretty well. And remind voters that in this time of crisis, the war in Europe, you need an experienced leader who's already proven himself on the international scene, and remind them, as I said, of Le Pen's pro-Putin credentials.
Right, but it will be interesting to see. So far, the race seems domestic issues seem to be dominant. It would be interesting to see if Macron could somehow capitalize on his stature, certainly within Europe in recent years, or rather, it's really going to come down to pocketbook issues in the final round of voting.
Yeah, even though he's done a very decent job on the economy, but again, he's perceived as a president of the rich and of the elitists, like he lowered taxes.
A neoliberal.
He's a very pro-business president, right. But this doesn't necessarily talk to all voters.
All right, well, we'll see if he could try to make that conversation with them. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for joining us.